We'll now look at the synapse, and in order to know and appreciate this picture here, I will need to take you back to a few slides before. Okay, recall this slide where I briefly mentioned where the synapse lies. I'm just going to highlight to you in green again. Synapses are found in between neurons, and synapses are very special in that they allow the transmission of nerve impulses across a space. So you can see that there's actually a space, there is a junction where there is no nervous tissue present, right? So the fact that it can cause a nerve impulse to be transmitted shows that there are certain adaptations of the synapse that we are going to look into, right? So if we were to look at one of these green segments, we're going to zoom into one of this is what we will see. And that's where I'll bring you to this slide, where you will see a junction over here. So the space that I was talking about is actually this space here. Okay, the space between the first neuron and the second neuron. So this is neuron number 2 and this is neuron number 1. So neuron number 1, as you know, all neurons will end with the axon terminal. So what you're seeing here, like a button-like structure here in neuron number 1, is known as the axon terminal. Alright, and in neuron number 2, what you see here is the start of the second neuron, and that's why we start with dendron. So you can see it ends with an axon that terminates at the synapse, and after the synapse, the dendron of the second neuron receives the nerve impulses, right? So what exactly is a synapse? We define it as such, right? We define it as a junction between two neurons, right? So impulses are transmitted from the axon of neuron number 1 to the dendron across a space, and that space is known as a synapse. Okay, and how then can the nervous impulse be transmitted when there is a space, right? So you need something special, and that special thing is a chemical neurotransmitters. So if you look at these these black dots here, they actually represent chemical neurotransmitters. Alright, these chemical neurotransmitters will act as postmen or messengers that will bring the impulse from the first neuron to the second neuron, right? And this transmission is via chemical means. So it's different from the normal nervous transmission that happens down a normal neuron, that is an electrical transmission. Here what we see that is that transmission across the synapse is a chemical form of transmission. Alright, so that's all I have to say about the synapse. Now we're going to look at nerves. Alright, so far what you have learned is a single neuron. So these things that you have learned, the structure of the neurons, these are single neurons. This is a one, what I'm highlighting in green right now refers to one nerve cell. Okay, so how do you define nerves? Nerves are actually a bundle of nerve fibers. Okay, so when many nerve cells are bundled together, they are known as the nerve. Okay, so nerves that emerge from the brains, we call them the cranial nerves. So nerves that actually allow us to blink our eyes, to move our mouth, to listen, all these are cranial nerves. Alright, and nerves that emerge from the spinal cord, such as nerves that allows us to move our legs, allows us to move our fingers and our hands and our arms, those are spinal nerves. Okay, so spinal nerves contain mixed fibers. They are made up of the sensory and motor nerve fibers, which I'll show you in the next slide, so don't worry. Okay, so I'll just run through another slide on the differences between the grey and white matter first. What you are seeing here is actually the long section of the central nervous system. So imagine you are actually looking upwards from the bottom of your body towards the brain. Okay, so if you are looking at a long section of your body, the cross section of the spinal cord looks like that. Okay, they have two different colors. Okay, the darker segment, which I'm now trying to color in green, this darker segment here is known as the gray matter. Okay, and the darker segment in the brain, you can see it's opposite. Instead of being in the central region, is now at the sides, the peripheral area of the brain. Okay, then what is the white matter? I will use yellow color to highlight the white matter. So the white matter is the other portion, the other side. Okay, so in the spinal cord, the white matter is the outer layer, whereas the brain's central regions will be the white matter. Alright, so you can see that it's opposite. The white matter is found around the sides of the spinal cord and in the central regions of the brain, while the opposite is true for the gray matter. Okay, so what's so significant about the gray matter and the white matter? Okay, the gray matter is gray because when you observe it under microscopes, you see that there is a much darker shade to it, and the reason is because of the cell bodies. Cell bodies are always found within the gray matter of both the spinal cord and the brain. Okay, while white matter appears white because it is less shaded due to the fact that they are mainly nerve fibers, they are not cell bodies. Okay, so they appear lighter when you view it under the microscope. Okay, gray matter is found, like I said earlier, on the outer layers of the brain and the central regions of the spinal cord. And for the white matter, it will be the opposite. Central parts of the brain, outer layers of the spinal cord. Okay, so now we're going to put together all these definitions and we're going to see how they all come together in the human body. Recall, right from the start, I told you that the spinal cord stems from the brain, and the spinal cord goes downwards in this way, and this is the central nervous system. Whatever branches out from the spinal cord makes up the peripheral nervous system. So these are the spinal nerves that branches out from the spinal cord. Alright, so the spinal cord is encased within the vertebral column, also known as your backbone. Okay, and the spinal nerves actually emerge from the spinal cord. So there are 31 pairs of these spinal nerves and they emerge at intervals along the length of the spinal cord. So depending, sometimes when you injure yourself, you may injure certain parts of the spinal cord, and that may cause certain functions of your body to be compromised, such as like sometimes when you injure your lower back, you can't move your arm, for example, or if you injure your upper back, you can't twist your body as well, and the reason is because the spinal nerves that come out from the spinal cord is also damaged because of the damage that is done to the central nervous system, which is the spinal cord. Okay, alright, so here we have once again the gray matter. You can see right in the middle of the spinal cord, and then within the gray matter, right, you can see a small little circle here, okay, which I've highlighted in green. That is actually known as the central canal. It contains this thing known as the cerebrospinal fluid, and it runs through the middle of the spinal cord to nourish the spinal cord, to give basically your spinal cord the function that it needs. Okay, so each spinal nerve will divide into two roots, right? Spinal nerves, we recall, is whatever branches out from the central nervous system. So these are spinal nerves. Alright, this whole area is the spinal nerves. Okay, and they divide into two roots, the dorsal root and the ventral roots. Okay, so the dorsal root is here in green, and you can see that the dorsal root is mainly made up of the sensory neurons because of the regularly shaped nucleus over here. Okay, and the ventral root, which I'll highlight in blue, is mainly made up of the motor neurons. Alright, because you can see that the cell body starts right at the start, okay, and the cell body is not somewhere in the middle like the sensory neurons. So you must be able to highlight where the dorsal root is and where the ventral root is. Okay, so the dorsal root, recall, it contains only sensory neurons, and you know it because of the position of the cell body. Okay, and I just want to highlight to you this term here, the dorsal root ganglion. This is where the cell bodies of the sensory neurons are clustered. So when the cell bodies all cluster here, there is a bulge. So the bulge is known by scientists to be the dorsal root ganglion, and because of that bulge, you can also safely identify where the sensory nerves are. And the sensory nerves is where the sensory neurons are, which is highlighted in green. Okay. And here we have the ventral roots, which contains only the motor neurons. Okay, grey matter, I've already told you about it. And grey matter is where all the cell bodies are. So you can see very clearly if I were to highlight it to you in a different color, maybe yellow. These are where the cell bodies are. And you can see that the cell bodies are all mainly within the grey matter. Okay, let me just highlight it in red because it's not clearly shown in yellow. So these are where the cell bodies are. You can see that the cell bodies are all found within the grey matter of the central nervous system, and that's why we call that the grey matter. Okay, last slide before I end this segment. So we have got the sensory nerve and the motor nerves. They combine, right? They will actually, until a certain point in time, they will merge, and they run together in the same area. We call this area the spinal nerve. Okay, it contains nerve fibers from both the dorsal root and the ventral root, which means that the spinal nerves have got both sensory neurons and motor neurons at the same time. Okay, just know that there's this portion that we call the spinal nerves that is mixed of both sensory and motor neurons. Okay.